What if I told you that a compliment could actually be, well, a deeply harmful stereotype, something
Mm.
that acts as a powerful tool to divide, obscure, and even control?
Hmm.
Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into something that, on the surface sounds like praise, maybe even effusive praise, but is really anything but.
Yeah.
We're talking about the model minority myth.
Yeah.
And this exploration, it's anchored in a close examination of excerpts from The Harmful Illusion of the Model Minority Myth.
Right.
So, our mission here is to really unpack this pervasive concept. We want to trace its origins, define its characteristics, and crucially understand why it's such a profound problem, especially paradoxically, for the very communities it supposedly praises.
And what's really critical here, I think, is that this seemingly benign label, this accolade, isn't just misleading. It's actually, it's strategic. It actively operates as a significant barrier, a misdirection.
Yeah.
It's designed to deflect, divide, and deny. So this deep dive, it's not just about defining the model minority myth.
Yeah.
It's about revealing exactly how it functions, why it was created, and the, frankly, devastating, often unseen impact it truly has on diverse communities.
That paradox you mentioned is stark, isn't it?
It really is. It portrays certain marginalized ethnic groups, and Asian Americans are the most prominent example, as exceptionally successful, hardworking, law-abiding, academically gifted, often in a very deliberate, implied contrast to other racial minorities.
Right.
Yet, as our source material makes abundantly clear, this portrayal is deeply harmful. The core argument, which we're going to unpack thoroughly, is that this myth, quote, masks structural inequalities, pits minority groups against one another, and erases the diversity and struggles within those communities.
So, really pulling back the curtain on that illusion today.
Exactly. Together.
Yeah. Okay, so we're talking about a stereotype masquerading as a compliment. A truly deceptive illusion, as you said. But where does an idea like this even start? Does it just bubble up from society? Or was there something more strategic going on right from the beginning?
That's a fundamental question, absolutely. And the answer immediately points to the myth's strategic use. No, it didn't just, spontaneously appear.
Hmm.
If we step back a bit, the framework shows the term gained significant, and I'd say deliberate, traction in the United States back in the 1960s,
The 60s, okay.
a period that was, as you know, a real crucible of immense social and political upheaval, especially around the civil rights movement.
And it wasn't just a casual observation, was it? The source makes a point that mainstream media and maybe even more importantly, policymakers played a direct active role. They specifically pointed to Japanese and Chinese Americans as these model minorities.
Precisely.
What was the implied contrast there? What were they trying to signal?
That subtext is just crucial. These communities were held up, championed even, as groups who overcame racism through hard work and cultural values.
Okay, hard work, cultural values.
But the unspoken implication, the really powerful part, was that they achieved this instead of through protest, activism, or demanding civil rights reform,
Oh, all right.
which were the very methods other racialized groups, particularly Black Americans, were using at that exact time. So it suggested a different path, maybe a more palatable path to success, at least palatable to the existing power structures.
It served a purpose then.
Oh, absolutely. A very distinct political purpose,
Yeah.
especially against the backdrop of the Cold War, right? The U.S. wanted to project this image globally, a beacon of opportunity, meritocracy, even for minorities, a stark contrast to communist nations.
This wasn't accidental then? The source even points to a specific, pretty potent example, doesn't it?
It does. A really key piece was that 1966 New York Times Magazine article by sociologist William Peterson.
Right, I remember reading about that.
And it didn't just casually praise Japanese Americans for their, quote, success despite discrimination. The really critical part, the bit that reveals the myth's core function, was its explicit implication
Which was?
that other groups, like Black Americans, should emulate them. It wasn't just a pat on the back.
Yeah.
It was a directive, a thinly veiled critique, really, turning this narrative of success into a weapon of comparison and ultimately control.
So it actively diverted attention from systemic issues.
Exactly, by framing it as individual responsibility. You succeed or fail on your own merits, supposedly.
Okay, this completely reshapes how we should understand the myth's purpose. It clearly benefits those who want to maintain the status quo. It's almost like a societal sleight of hand. How does it manage to create such a powerful illusion? How does it stop us seeing the complicated, often brutal realities of systemic oppression?
Well, the strategic utility is pretty profound. It worked in several key ways, each serving a specific agenda. Firstly, and maybe most obviously, It deflected attention from systemic racism. By holding up the apparent success of one group, it allowed those in power to minimize or sideline, or even just outright deny the existence of those deep structural barriers that were holding back other minority communities. It became a convenient
To
counterargument.
demands for racial justice.
Precisely. And secondly, it cleverly suggested that success is purely about individual effort and, cultural values, that whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps idea.
Which is incredibly powerful.
It is, because it shifts the blame away from societal failures, institutional problems, onto the communities themselves. If one group can make it without demanding systemic change, the unspoken question is, why can't others? It completely sidesteps the historical legacies of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, ongoing state violence, all these things foundational to the experiences of other racial groups.
So it benefits anyone who wants to avoid tackling those root causes of racial inequality.
Absolutely. It essentially says the system's fine, it's you who needs to try harder, or maybe your culture needs to adapt.
That makes so much sense. It really is like a smokescreen. Look over here at the successful group, so you don't look over there at the systems failing others. So given this strategic origin, what exactly are the characteristics that make up this model image? What does the myth actually claim about these groups?
Well, the myth paints a very specific picture, almost idealized, right? A highly curated set of traits that supposedly define these communities. It's aspirational, maybe, but ultimately damaging because it's just such a reductionist fantasy.
Yeah, the source breaks these down really clearly. First, there's academic excellence, this pervasive assumption that, quote, Asians are assumed to excel in STEM, have high test scores, and overachieve.
We've all seen that one.
Oh, yeah. It's not just a casual observation. It becomes this heavy expectation, a label that's incredibly hard to escape. It implies this sort of monolithic academic skill across a huge, diverse population.
Right. Leading to the expectation that every Asian American kid should naturally be good at science, technology, engineering, math. And not just good, but excel.
Dominate, even. And that shapes everything: curriculum, counseling, parental pressure, even a kid's own self-image. It can force them onto this narrow path that might be totally wrong for them just to fit the stereotype.
And that feeds directly into the second characteristic, economic success. The perception is that Asian Americans are uniformly, quote, affluent, entrepreneurial, and professionally successful.
Right, the stereotype of thriving businesses, high-paying jobs in medicine or engineering, general economic stability.
Exactly. This narrative of widespread wealth subtly suggests that, economic hardship within these communities is rare, almost non-existent, which, as we'll get into, is a massive distortion.
It completely masks things like the bamboo ceiling, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, where, despite excelling academically, professionally, Asian Americans often hit barriers getting into senior leadership. They get pigeonholed into technical roles, not the executive suite.
Okay, and the third characteristic is social obedience. This is the stereotype of being, quote, compliant, non-political, and easy to assimilate.
The quiet minority.
Exactly. Paints a picture of a group that just integrates smoothly, doesn't cause trouble, doesn't challenge norms, and crucially, doesn't demand significant social or political change.
It's framed as the direct opposite of that visible, often disruptive civil rights activism we were talking about earlier. It echoes the myth's original framing.
And these traits, academic excellence, economic success, social obedience, they're often romanticized, presented as purely positive things. But the source is really clear that they have real-world, often deeply negative consequences.
Absolutely. That expectation of quiet compliance, for instance, it effectively silences legitimate grievances. It discourages political organizing. It can lead to a real lack of advocacy for basic rights within the community itself. It's not a golden ticket. It's more like an invisible cage.
So the deep irony here, the thing we're uncovering, is how this seemingly positive label, model minority, just utterly flattens the incredible diversity within these communities.
Completely flattens it. When we use the term Asian American, it sounds like one single unified group. But the source powerfully reminds us this umbrella term includes over 20-plus ethnic groups.
Over 20.
Just pause and think about that. Over 20 distinct cultures, languages, histories, socioeconomic backgrounds, migration stories, religious practices, all crammed under one convenient but totally misleading label. It's statistical malpractice almost.
That's such a crucial point, and it gets lost all the time in public discussion. It's not just about different countries. It's about vastly different experiences, privileges, struggles within that massive category.
Exactly.
The myth, as the source says, ignores class differences and the fact that many Asian American subgroups face high levels of poverty, deportation, and educational barriers. That's a world away from the perception of universal success.
A world away.
And the source gives examples, right? Contrasting, say, wealthy Indian Americans with underrepresented Laotian, Hmong, and Cambodian communities. Their experiences couldn't be more different, yet the myth just erases the struggles of the latter, makes their needs invisible.
It's like looking at a huge, diverse forest and only seeing the tallest trees, completely ignoring the struggling undergrowth that needs light and water.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
And this broad brushstroke, it actively obscures the reality on the ground. It has devastating effects. When policymakers, educators, the public assume this uniform success,
Right.
it means the specific acute needs of certain subgroups like refugee communities arriving with trauma, limited English, few resources, or those facing language barriers, discrimination, they get completely overlooked.
It was a cruel statistical flattening.
It is. It has severe real-world consequences. It actively prevents targeted help, funding, social support where it's desperately needed. And this is exactly where the seeming complement turns into an active barrier to equity. Because if you're already a model, why would you possibly need help?
Okay, here's where it gets really alarming, and maybe even a bit cynical. This stereotype creates this dangerous illusion that then gets weaponized. It manufactures, quote, the illusion that racism is no longer a barrier. If one group, supposedly a minority, can achieve success through sheer individual effort, then the narrative shifts subtly but powerfully away from systemic problems towards blaming individuals or groups for their own struggles. That's profoundly damaging.
It truly is. The myth becomes this highly effective, almost insidious, divisive tool. The source explains in stark terms how it is used to delegitimize movements for racial justice among other groups.
How does it do that?
It's that insidious whisper, sometimes an outright shout. If Asians can do it, why can't Black or Latinx people? That exact phrasing from the source captures perfectly how the myth is weaponized.
Wow.
It sets up this false comparison, deliberately ignores the unique histories and ongoing systemic barriers different groups face, and then it pits marginalized communities against each other.
Instead of fostering solidarity.
Exactly. Which is essential for challenging white supremacy and systemic inequality. Instead, it cultivates resentment, misunderstanding, competition. It fractures potential alliances for collective liberation.
It's a classic divide and conquer strategy, isn't it?
Textbook.
It frames the problem as internal to other communities, like a lack of hard work or the right cultural values, rather than a pervasive societal issue that affects everyone differently.
Right. It effectively says, racism doesn't exist anymore. Look at the model group. If you're not succeeding, it's your own fault.
Which is incredibly disempowering. It shuts down those critical, uncomfortable conversations about institutional barriers, generational wealth gaps, ongoing discrimination.
It lets society off the hook, abdicate responsibility for addressing systemic problems.
So this raises a really important, maybe difficult question. What's the emotional cost, the psychological cost for individuals within these communities who are supposedly being complemented by this myth?
Yeah, the internal toll is immense, particularly around mental health, and it's largely invisible to the outside world.
That's a crucial point, often missed. The source highlights that Asian American students often feel intense pressure to live up to unrealistic academic or professional expectations. Just imagine carrying that weight constantly. It's not just wanting to succeed for yourself. It's the burden of representing an entire group, embodying a stereotype, fulfilling some external destiny. If society expects you to be a math whiz, get into an Ivy League, become a doctor.
It's suffocating.
Totally. It's not just striving for personal success. It's avoiding the deep shame, the perceived dishonor of not meeting this impossible, often totally misaligned external standard. It leads to anxiety, depression, burnout, isolation.
And compounding that pressure is a cultural aspect the source mentions. Quote, seeking help is stigmatized, and failure is viewed as deeply shameful. This connects directly to those pressures. If admitting you're struggling or that you failed to meet these mythic expectations is taboo, a source of dishonor for your family, then people often just suffer in silence.
Which leads to a critical lack of access to mental health support.
Exactly. Seeking help might be seen as weakness, a deviation from the model image of resilience, or even a deep shame for the family. So the internal toll manifests as this silent crisis, hidden behind a veneer of success, eroding well-being.
Okay, so if a community is seen as universally successful, what happens when they do need help? When they are victims of injustice? What are the real-world policy implications of this gilded cage?
This is precisely where the myth actively silences injustice and creates huge policy blind spots. Because of this pervasive successful image, the source points out, quite damningly, that Asian Americans may be overlooked in policy, affirmative action, and social welfare programs.
Because the narrative is they don't need it.
Right. If the story is they don't face barriers, they're self-reliant, they excel on their own, then there's no perceived need for targeted support, affirmative action, specific safety nets. They become invisible in the very systems designed to address inequality.
Just assumed to be fine.
Always resilient, never truly needing help, which leads to underfunding of community services, poor data collection, a general lack of recognition for their unique challenges.
And we saw this play out so starkly, so painfully during the COVID-19 pandemic. The source explicitly says anti-Asian violence contradicts the myth, yet it often leaves the public confused due to prior assumptions of acceptance and success.
It was jarring, wasn't it? Horrifying for many to see this surge of violence and hate directed at a group they'd been told was thriving, accepted, assimilated.
It completely exposed the myth's fragility.
Violently exposed it. When reality punched through that illusion, people were left wondering, how could model citizens suddenly become targets, subject to slurs, assaults, even murder?
The myth leaves no way to understand it.
Exactly. No framework for understanding that a group can experience perceived success in some areas while still facing pervasive racism, xenophobia, deep vulnerability in others. It creates this cognitive dissonance that makes it incredibly hard for society to respond effectively or empathetically.
Let's dig into some more concrete examples where this myth really plays out, affecting lives, shaping perceptions, influencing policy.
Yeah, let's do that. What's really striking is how the myth fuels these intense public debates about Asian American, quote, overrepresentation in elite institutions, debates that often mask underlying discrimination.
This is a huge topic, often really contentious. The source points specifically to places like Harvard and MIT. The perception, driven heavily by the model minority myth, is that Asian American applicants are disproportionately successful at getting into these top universities, especially in STEM.
Which then leads to claims of reverse discrimination against other groups.
Right. And the outcome of that perception, according to the source, is often discriminatory itself. It notes it sometimes leads to discriminatory admissions policies. The example given is the whole personality score controversies.
Explain that a bit more.
Well, the argument, often used by those against affirmative action or pushing for changes in admissions, is that while Asian American applicants might excel on academic metrics, they supposedly lack in subjective areas soft skills, leadership, personality.
Ah, the subjective measures.
Exactly. And this becomes a convenient, if thinly veiled, justification to cap their numbers or favor other groups, even those with lower academic scores.
So it essentially penalizes them for living up to the very academic excellence the myth demands.
Precisely. While maintaining this illusion of a merit-based, unbiased system, it really makes you question how holistic review can be weaponized, doesn't it?
Deeply troubling.
Okay, this next example, it really shows the raw, brutal reality that just shatters the myth's veneer. It lays bare how conditional it all is. The source powerfully highlights the spike in anti-Asian violence in 2020-2021.
A terrifying period. A dramatic, undeniable rise in hate crimes targeting Asian communities, especially visible when the COVID-19 pandemic hit.
And this horrific wave of events, it just profoundly revealed the myth's inherent fragility. As the source says, chillingly, these communities were suddenly recast from model citizens to dangerous outsiders.
1 minute, the embodiment of quiet success. The next, scapegoated for a global pandemic. Subjected to harassment, abuse, assault, murder.
It showed how conditional that model minority status always was.
Absolutely. It was never about real acceptance or belonging. It was about utility, convenience for the dominant narrative. When that narrative wasn't convenient anymore, when tensions flared, the underlying racism just surged to the surface.
Proving the myth was just a thin veil, not a shield.
Exactly. Acceptance under the model minority myth is granted, not earned, and it can be revoked instantly.
This brings up that crucial question about data again and how we perceive success. It goes back to flattening diversity. Because the overall Asian American category is so broad, it hides these huge, often devastating disparities.
Yes, the myth of universal success is particularly insidious when you drill down into specific subgroups. It reveals a completely different reality.
The source brings up the critical but often overlooked struggles of Southeast Asian youth, right? Naming Cambodian, Haitian, and Laotian students.
Exactly. And what's critical is that these groups often have lower graduation rates and face significant socioeconomic challenges, a reality that directly contradicts the academic excellence and economic success pillars of the myth,
But their struggles get overlooked.
because their data points get buried in the larger, more successful aggregated statistics for the entire Asian American category. Their unique, pressing needs aren't addressed by schools, social services, policymakers.
Why does that happen? Just oversight.
It's because, as the source says, aggregated data masks differences within the Asian category. When you lump everyone together, the high success rates of some subgroups, certain East Asian or South Asian communities, for example, artificially inflate the overall stats.
Making the struggles of others invisible.
Precisely. It prevents targeted help, even the recognition of these groups' unique histories, refugee experiences, ongoing challenges. So the data aggregation isn't just an oversight. It becomes a tool for the myth to persist. It prevents resources from going where they're desperately needed, a statistical illusion causing real suffering.
It's so clear that the myth doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It interacts with other fundamental parts of identity, gender, class, race relations, making things even more complex, layering disadvantage.
Exactly right. This is where intersectionality becomes so powerful in understanding the nuances the myth completely misses. Let's take gender, for instance. The source points out Asian women are often stereotyped as submissive or hypersexualized.
That's a deeply damaging double bind.
It really is dehumanizing. On one hand, the model minority myth might suggest this quiet, compliant figure. On the other, these deeply racist and sexist tropes reduce Asian women to fetishized objects.
Which increases vulnerability to violence and exploitation. We saw that horrifically with the Atlanta spa shootings in 2021.
It's a stark example. These intersecting stereotypes deny Asian women their full humanity, erase their individuality, their agency, their complex experiences. They're not seen as whole people.
And then there's class. The myth's economic success pillar just completely ignores this. The source emphasizes how the myth hides the economic precarity of recent immigrants, especially refugees and undocumented Asians.
Communities who might arrive with nothing, fleeing war or persecution, carrying trauma, facing huge language barriers, complex legal issues.
Often trapped in low-wage jobs, struggling desperately, living in fear of deportation.
And the model minority myth, by painting this picture of universal wealth and easy success, actively blinds society to their urgent needs. It prevents necessary social services, education support, economic aid from reaching them.
It's a cruel irony. The supposed complement pushes vulnerable populations further into the shadows.
And finally, maybe most insidiously, its impact on race relations. The myth is expertly used as a wedge, a deliberate tool to fracture solidarity between marginalized groups. It serves to reinforce anti-Blackness, as the source forcefully states, by holding up one group as successful because they supposedly conform, work hard, don't protest. It implicitly, often explicitly, criticizes other racialized groups for their resistance or perceived lack of individual achievement.
It diverts attention from the shared roots of oppression.
Exactly. The shared systemic roots affecting all non-white communities. Instead, it fosters resentment, division, a false sense of competition. It makes it so much harder for diverse groups to unite, build coalitions, advocate for collective liberation.
This mechanism of division, pitting groups against each other.
It's perhaps one of the most destructive and enduring aspects of the myth. It maintains the very hierarchy it pretends to disrupt.
So after all this, what does it really mean for us? What's the ultimate takeaway from this deep dive into the harmful illusion of the model minority myth? It shows us something crucial, doesn't it? Something far more sinister than just a simple misunderstanding or a clumsy compliment. The source gives us a really powerful summary, stating it unequivocally. The model minority myth is not a compliment. It's a tool of white supremacy and neoliberal ideology.
That's the core takeaway right
Yeah.
there. And it demands our critical attention. It's not accidental. It's a sophisticated mechanism designed to uphold a particular power structure.
Its functions are pretty clear now.
Yeah. It rewards assimilation,
Yeah.
pushing conformity over cultural preservation or authenticity. It deliberately obscures structural inequality, pulling the wool over our eyes about the systemic nature of racism and disadvantage. And critically, it limits genuine understanding of racial complexity. It flattens everything into this simplistic, misleading story.
And that neoliberal ideology part is key too, isn't it? Emphasizing individual responsibility.
Exactly. It conveniently sidesteps history, systemic barriers, unequal access, effectively blames individuals for societal failures.
So by appearing to uplift, to praise, it actually controls, it divides, and it profoundly distorts our understanding of reality. It's like societal gaslighting.
That's a good way to put it.
It makes those who question it seem ungrateful, and makes those suffering under its weight feel invisible, or worse, responsible for their own unacknowledged struggles. It stops us having real, honest conversations about equity, justice, what success and belonging really mean for everyone.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, really understanding this fundamentally shifts how we think about success and progress in society, doesn't it?
Mhm.
It forces us to look beyond superficial praise, to examine the power dynamics hidden in all seemingly benign narratives.
Which leads to a final thought for you, the listener.
Yeah, it raises an important question, I think. In this world just saturated with information where headlines and sound bites simplify everything, how can you consistently look beyond those surface-level narratives? How can you challenge the assumptions buried in seemingly positive stereotypes, especially when they might be hiding deeper, uncomfortable truths?
It's about staying curious, isn't it?
It's about cultivating that deep curiosity, that constant critical thinking, always asking, who benefits from this story? And what inconvenient truths might it be intentionally hiding from view? That's the challenge for all of us.